Hey everybody, I'm Aaron Simmons. This is Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves, April 5th, 2023. I just released a new monthly newsletter over at my website, jaaronsimmons.com. Be sure to go over there and get subscribed so that I can get you that. It's got great exclusive content and really cool ideas that are in a longer form than I'm able to do here on these videos. So please do get subscribed to that. And also, while you're at it, subscribe here to Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves so we can keep thinking together in more regular ways. All right, today, I want to think with you a little bit about the idea of social trust. We live in a society, at least here in America, but I think this is a global phenomenon, where social trust is becoming less and less prominent, less common. We are suspicious of each other, especially if we disagree with each other about fundamental ideas like religion and politics. Now, it's important to understand that the kind of suspicion I'm talking about here is personal suspicion. It's the kind of thing where we end up reading someone else through a very particular lens. And that lens is one that assumes they are manipulating me, they are evil relative to my theory of the good, they are a problem, a threat to the democratic frame in which I understand justice to play out. That's different than what sometimes is referred to as a hermeneutics of suspicion. This is the idea cultivated by thinkers like Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche, who encourage us simply not to take things for granted, not to allow our assumptions to override our good judgment. That what we should do when we think, when we engage, is recognize that questions are things that can be articulated and deployed, even relative to what is very often referred to as obvious or simply taken for granted in our world. That hermeneutics of suspicion is something that cultivates philosophical rigor, philosophical engagement and investment in a world that far too often is more complicated and requires more nuance than we might think. The kind of suspicion that wrecks our social trust is where we start viewing our discursive partners, our interlocutors, our conversational partners as problems to be dismissed rather than as invitations to rethink our own conceptions. Now, this is a tricky idea, and social trust has lots of different dimensions and components. I'd highly recommend that you look at the work of Kevin Vallier and some others who are working on this in the context of very technical philosophy. But here I want to throw out just a simple idea. Jacques Derrida says that there is no justice, and by implication, there can be no real democratic space without what he calls faith and trust in the other. Trust in the other. Now, that doesn't mean that we trust that the other person is always saying true things, that they are always good intentioned, that they are always operating in good faith. What it means is that we have to assume that we are all invested in social flourishing and the dignity of all the participants in that flourishing. If that can't be something that we are resting upon, we inevitably end up seeing the very people we need to work with as the obstacle to getting work done. In order to give this maybe a philosophical slant, I want to suggest that a weird phrase that Derrida articulates in the context of a discussion of Kierkegaard can actually be helpful in two ways for reminding us about the importance of social trust and how we might try to cultivate it. The phrase is in French, tout autre et tout autre. The English here is a little bit slippy, but it's basically every other is absolutely other. In other words, every other person, every other is absolutely uniquely distinguished as who they are. There's no way to encapsulate them or reduce them to some broader category. Now, you might hear the kind of Levinasian register at which this claim from Derrida is being presented. We've talked about Levinas for the past few weeks, and so this idea of the other being absolutely other and laying claim on me because of her otherness is something that I think Derrida is intentionally trying to build upon. But rather than getting into the weeds of this French idea that Derrida is presenting in his reading of Kierkegaard, I want to suggest two simple ways that this phrase, this idea, this encouragement can be deployed in our social lives that I think are really productive. The first is this. Every other is absolutely other means we can't assume that we've got the other person figured out just because we know who they voted for, where they stand on a political issue, what church they might attend. Now, this is troubling because we do have to engage in some degree of, grouping, right? If somebody says, I hold that Q, well, then there are probably things that follow about Q-believing people. And that's just necessary for being able to operate in social discourse. We've got to make some assumptions. But we can never make those assumptions absolute. And that, I think, is Derrida's point. We've got to instead be open to being surprised by the other person. They hold that Q, but wow, they hold Q in a way that I wasn't expecting. Maybe Q I think's problematic, but the particular version of Q that's being articulated has something that causes me to rethink my objection to Q. It's that openness in our discursive practice, in our conversational engagement with others, that actually then maybe underwrites that idea of social trust being essential for our commitments to justice, to deliberation. In order to think well with others, I've got to assume that the other is not immediately irrational or immoral. I'm showing charity, hermeneutic charity, interpretive charity, moral charity, until I'm proven wrong in doing so. That idea of not dismissing the other, but taking them seriously and listening to how they articulate what they articulate is crucial for social trust to be possible in our society. The second idea, though, is that every other is absolutely other also means that every other is necessarily an instance of radical dignity. In other words, I can't eliminate the moral status of the other regardless of how deep our disagreements go, or at least how deep we think they might go. This is important because why should we be so invested in the view of the other, the beliefs of the other, the arguments of the other? Precisely because we are committed to truth, or should be, but also because the other person is a unit of infinite moral dignity, again, think Levinas, in a way that then cannot be overridden simply because of radical disagreements about how society should function. So not only should I listen to the other because I can't assume I've got them all figured out, but also I should listen to the other because they are someone who is worth my listening. Here, the moral and epistemic registers come together, and that's why social trust is not just about recognizing everyone else as neighbors, but also recognizing them as conversation partners in the process of thinking about what justice means. Now, of course, this is a complicated idea because it's one that does not mean we never are critical. We don't eventually realize that someone is irrational or that their immorality is overriding their good judgment, right? Critique is part of how we engage in an appropriately trusting space. When trust is operative, trust can also be lost with good reasons. But maybe if we lean into this Derridian idea, tout autre et tout autre, every other is absolutely other, we can begin to see two ways in which social trust can be maybe restored a little bit. The other person is morally dignified, even if wrong. And the other person's arguments are worth considering and engaging until they are proven no longer justifiable. Those commitments also require humility and hospitality from me. But humility and hospitality, I would argue, are core virtues of democratic, deliberative, and moral life. I hope this is helpful. A complicated idea, hopefully made practical in ways that can encourage us to listen a little bit deeper to those with whom we disagree. Doesn't mean we've got to agree with them. And it doesn't mean that we don't offer critique back. But we can stop being so quick to dismiss, to ignore, and to label them as not worthy of our time. Every other is absolutely other, and it matters. I'll see you next time, unless a piano falls on our heads.